In July of 2022, the San Antonio sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of a defunct Super Save supermarket. A road crew, tasked with demolishing the lot, worked with practiced monotony. The rhythmic pounding of a jackhammer suddenly changed pitch, from a solid, percussive crack to a hollow, resonant thud. The operator stopped, puzzled. Blueprints showed only compacted earth and gravel beneath this unusually thick speed bump. Inside the cavity his tool had created, shielded from the light for nearly 4 decades, was a perfectly preserved human skeleton curled in a fetal position. Near the fractured skull lay the rusted head of a felling axe, and glinting in the sudden daylight, still attached to a leather belt, was a tarnished silver buckle engraved with the simple, elegant initials, LG. At that moment, the case of the disappearance of Luis Garza, who vanished 40 years ago, was reopened. October 12, 1982. The morning air was crisp. Luis Garza, 34 years old, knotted his tie with practiced ease. His wife had laid out his best suit, the charcoal grey one he wore when he wanted to make an impression. At his waist, the silver belt buckle she'd given him for their anniversary caught the light. He was a man of details, both in his appearance and his work. It was this meticulous nature that made him one of the top insurance agents in the San Antonio branch. He kissed his 2 children goodbye, their sleepy faces a reminder of why he worked so hard, and promised his wife he'd be home by 6 for dinner. At his desk, surrounded by the orderly world of policies and premiums, he reviewed his files for the day. He was successful, but the pressure to maintain that success was constant. A new house in a growing suburb meant a larger mortgage. He circled a name on his calendar with a red pen: Teresa Hollis. He mentioned to a colleague that he had one last meeting, an informal chat to clear up some inconsistencies in a large claim. "Probably just a misunderstanding," he said, tapping the file. "But you know me. Better to sort it out face to face before it gets complicated." His intent was not accusatory. It was thorough. He believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. He left the office just after 3 p.m., the sun high in the Texas sky. He drove his sedan towards the new Super Save, a symbol of the suburban boom that promised prosperity for families like his. He was thinking about the weekend, about the lumber he needed to buy to build the treehouse he'd promised his son. It was a simple domestic thought, the kind that fills the mind of a man who believes he has a long future ahead of him. He pulled into the sprawling parking lot, found a spot, and locked his car, leaving his briefcase on the passenger seat. Eyewitnesses later told police they saw a man matching his description, impeccably dressed, confident stride, walking across the lot. He was heading towards the rear section, where yellow tape still cordoned off areas where a construction crew was finishing the paving work. He was just one more person in a busy, ordinary place. And then, he was gone. He was not seen again. The 5 o'clock phone call to his wife never came. The dinner grew cold on the stove. Against the backdrop of ringing cash registers and families loading groceries into their cars, Luis Garza vanished. The world for him simply stopped. Detective Daniel Romero, a man who had dedicated his career to San Antonio's forgotten dead, stood at the edge of the yellow tape. 40 years of silence had been broken by a jackhammer. Before him, a construction site had become a grave, and a grave had become a crime scene. The forensic team moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, their white suits stark against the grimy asphalt. Every piece of gravel, every shard of bone, was treated as a sacred text that might, after 4 decades, finally tell its story. The scene was meticulously documented, photographed from every angle, the position of each piece of evidence measured and recorded before being carefully bagged. The initial findings came in a series of clipped professional reports. The skeleton belonged to an adult male, age estimated between 30 and 35. Height, approximately 5 feet 10 inches. The cause of death was obvious and brutal, a massive depressed fracture on the left parietal bone of the skull, an injury consistent with a single powerful blow from a heavy bladed instrument like the axe head found beside it. There were no other signs of struggle, no defensive wounds on the forearms. The attack had been sudden, overwhelming, and final. But it was the trace evidence that began to sketch the chilling outline of the crime. Microscopic analysis of the bones, conducted at the Bexar County Crime Lab, revealed something astonishing. Asphaltic binder, the tar-like substance used in paving, was not just on the skeleton. It was embedded within the porous, cancellous structure of the bones themselves. This wasn't a body buried in a shallow grave and then paved over. This was a body placed into hot, freshly laid asphalt. He had been entombed as the speed bump was being built. This single fact changed everything. It transformed the crime from a potential dumping into a calculated act of concealment that required specialized equipment and knowledge. The questions for Romero's team multiplied with each new piece of data. Who had access to a paving crew and its machinery in October of 1982? Who could operate with such confidence in a semi-public space that they could build a tomb in plain sight? Why was this speed bump, according to the original city plans, even here? It was poorly constructed, thicker and cruder than the others, an ugly anomaly on an otherwise professionally paved lot. It served no logical traffic flow purpose. It was not a speed bump. It was a sarcophagus. The killer, or killers, had not simply disposed of a body. They had integrated it into the very infrastructure of the new suburban landscape. They had hidden Luis Garza in the most mundane feature imaginable, a feature thousands of cars would drive over for the next 40 years. This was not a crime of passion. This was an operation meticulously planned and executed with a level of cold-blooded resolve that was deeply unsettling. The search was no longer just for a killer, but for an architect of a near-perfect crime. The 1982 case file for Luis Garza was thin, its manila folder yellowed and brittle with age. It told a story not of a meticulous investigation, but of a premature conclusion. Within the first 72 hours, the San Antonio Police Department had settled on a working theory. Luis Garza had voluntarily abandoned his life. He was a handsome, successful man in a high-pressure job. The narrative was simple, convenient, and required no body. Detectives pointed to the lack of a struggle at his car as evidence that he had left of his own accord, perhaps meeting someone for a new life he had planned in secret. This theory, however, willfully ignored every piece of contradictory evidence. Garza's bank accounts were untouched. His briefcase, containing nothing more than routine paperwork, sat on the passenger seat of his locked car. His family, when interviewed, was adamant. Luis was a devoted husband and father, a man building a future, not running from one. His wife presented a portrait of domestic stability, of plans for a treehouse and a family vacation. But her pleas were interpreted not as credible testimony, but as the predictable grief of a woman unwilling to accept she'd been left. The investigators of the era saw what they wanted to see. A rival insurance agent, with whom Garza had a public disagreement weeks prior, was briefly considered but never seriously pursued. The sprawling Super Save parking lot, parts of which were still an active construction site, was given only a cursory search. No one thought to question the paving crews or review their work orders. The possibility of foul play was acknowledged on paper, but dismissed in practice. The official search was scaled back after 2 weeks and then quietly closed. Luis Garza's disappearance became a local cautionary tale, the Super Save vanishing. It was a ghost story told in whispers, a piece of suburban lore. The file was boxed up and sent to archives, a monument to institutional inertia. For the police department of 1982, an abandoned family was a simpler problem to file away than a potential homicide with no leads. But that initial failure was more than just an error in judgment. It was a critical gift of time to the person or persons responsible. Every day, the runaway theory held, the trail grew colder. Every officer who accepted the easy answer became an unwitting accomplice in the concealment. The wall of silence that descended around the case was not built by a powerful conspiracy, but by a collective shrug of indifference, a form of complicity that allowed a man to lie entombed in asphalt while the world drove on right over his head. Detective Romero's team began the painstaking work of archaeology, digging not into asphalt, but into memory and paper. They tracked down former employees of Garza's insurance firm, now in their 70s and 80s, living in quiet retirement across the Sunbelt. Their recollections were faded Polaroids, vague impressions of a handsome young man in a sharp suit. They remembered his ambition, his smile, but the details of his last day were lost in a fog of 4 decades. They spoke of office gossip and old rivalries, names that led Romero's team down the same dead-end paths the original investigators had wandered. The human element was proving unreliable, a collection of ghosts whispering half-forgotten stories. So Romero turned to the archives, the silent, infallible witnesses. While one team re-examined the flawed police work of 1982, another delved into the city's municipal records, housed in a climate-controlled vault in the county courthouse basement. They were looking for anything related to the construction of the Super Save parking lot. The work was mind-numbing, a slow scroll through microfiche reels and brittle, dusty ledgers. Permits, inspection reports, supply chain manifests, a bureaucratic fossil record of a forgotten construction project. Simultaneously, they subpoenaed the archives of the insurance company. After weeks of negotiation, a box of microfiche cartridges arrived, containing the entirety of Luis Garza's client list from 1982. A young detective was tasked with the tedious process of digitizing every name, every policy number, every address. They were building 2 massive digital maps, one of the construction project, with every contractor and subcontractor, the other of Luis Garza's professional life, with every client and contact. The hope was that somewhere in the vast ocean of data, 2 names would intersect. For weeks, nothing. The lists remained parallel lines, 2 separate stories that refused to connect. The construction companies had no business with the insurance agent. The insurance agent's clients had no obvious link to the paving of a supermarket lot. The investigation felt stalled, buried under the sheer weight of its own data. Then, late one night, a researcher sifting through a stack of digitized supplier invoices from the construction site noticed an anomaly. The invoices were a monotonous list of bulk materials, tons of gravel, gallons of asphalt binder, cubic yards of sand. But on a manifest dated October 11, 1982, the day before Luis Garza disappeared, there was a single peculiar line item. It was a cash purchase for 1 felling axe with a 4-pound head and a hickory handle. There were no logging or tree-clearing permits associated with the Super Save construction site. A paving company had no logical need for such a tool. The deep dive into the 1982 case file, despite its flaws, did yield one seemingly concrete lead. Buried in the detective's notes was a detailed account of a public argument between Luis Garza and a rival agent, a man named Frank Miller. The incident had occurred at an industry conference just weeks before the disappearance. According to witnesses, Miller, an older agent whose sales had been slipping, accused Garza of poaching a lucrative corporate account. Voices were raised. Threats were allegedly made. For Romero's team, it was a classic motive, professional jealousy curdling into murderous rage. The theory was compellingly simple. Miller, enraged and facing financial decline, confronts Garza. The confrontation turns violent. Miller panics and disposes of the body at the nearby chaotic construction site. For the next 3 weeks, the full resources of the cold case unit were dedicated to finding Frank Miller. He had left the insurance business shortly after 1982 and fallen off the grid. Detectives spent hundreds of hours sifting through digital and paper records, old property deeds, credit histories, DMV records from 3 different states. The hunt led them from Texas to Florida and finally to a quiet retirement community nestled in the Arizona desert. The pieces seemed to be falling into place. A man with a motive who suddenly changes his life and moves away. It looked like flight. Two detectives, including Romero, flew to Arizona. They found Miller, now 85 years old, tending to his rose bushes. He was frail, but his mind was sharp. In a quiet, sunlit living room, they laid out their case. Miller listened patiently, his expression one of weary confusion. He remembered Luis Garza, calling him a talented kid, a real shark. He even remembered the argument. "We sold insurance, for God's sake," he said with a dry chuckle. "We argued about clients every other week. It was just business." Then he asked his wife to bring him a photo album. It was a thick, leather-bound book with the words Europe 82 embossed in gold on the cover. He turned the pages, showing them photographs of himself and his late wife posing in front of the Eiffel Tower, the Colosseum in Rome, the canals of Venice. He produced his old passport, its pages filled with the faded entry and exit stamps of half a dozen European countries. Airline ticket stubs and hotel receipts confirmed the timeline. Frank Miller had been out of the country from September 30th to November 5th of 1982. He had a verified, ironclad alibi for the entire month of October. The theory, so carefully constructed, collapsed into dust. The flight to Arizona had been a waste. The weeks of painstaking research had led to a complete dead end. The frustration in the squad room back in San Antonio was palpable. They were back at the beginning, with a body in a speed bump and a ghost for a killer. The path forward was once again completely, maddeningly obscure. After the dead end in Arizona, the investigation returned to the cold, hard data. The mood was grim, the path forward obscured by decades of silence. Detective Romero, a man defined by his patience, directed his team back to the archives, to the two vast, disconnected oceans of information, the construction records and Luis Garza's client list. He believed the answer wasn't in the memories of old men, but in the black and white ink of official documents. An archivist, tasked with re-examining every permit for the Super Save site, finally found the thread. It was a single document, a paving permit, issued in the third week of October 1982. The contractor of record was a small, local company, Hollis & Son Construction. The name meant nothing on its own, just another small business that had likely folded decades ago. But in the world of cold case investigation, every new name is a key to a door that hasn't been tried. Romero took the name back to his office. He sat before the digitized database of Luis Garza's 1982 client list. He typed Hollis into the search field. The query ran. Seconds stretched into a minute. The system cross-referenced thousands of names. And then, a single line of text appeared on the screen, a digital ping echoing across 40 years. Luis Garza had a client named Teresa Hollis. A few more clicks revealed her address, her family details, and listed as her next of kin was her younger brother, a man named Mark Hollis, owner and sole proprietor of Hollis & Son Construction. The two parallel lines had finally crossed. The connection was no longer a theory. It was a fact. The investigation now had a target. They found Mark Hollis living in a small, rundown house on the south side of San Antonio. He was in his late 70s, frail and walker-dependent, a ghost of the man who once ran a paving company. Romero and his partner sat with him in a cluttered living room that smelled of dust and regret. They didn't accuse. They simply laid out the facts. The body, the felling axe purchased the day before, the name of his company on the paving permit, the name of his sister on the victim's client list. For a long time, Mark Hollis said nothing, his gaze fixed on the worn carpet. Then, his shoulders began to shake. A dry, rasping sob escaped his lips. The dam of silence, which had held back a lifetime of guilt for 40 years, finally broke. He began to speak, his voice a weak whisper, confessing everything. He told them about the phone call from his older sister, Teresa. She was in a panic, on the verge of being exposed for a sophisticated insurance fraud scheme she had been running for years. Luis Garza, her meticulous agent, had found her out. Teresa's plan, as Mark recounted it, was cold, simple, and absolute. She lured Garza to the back of the parking lot, Mark's worksite, under the pretense of looking at a dent in her car. Mark was waiting, hidden in his work truck, the newly purchased axe on the seat beside him. It was over in a second. That night, under Teresa's calm and ruthless direction, they used the company's equipment to dig a shallow trench, place Garza's body inside, and build a crude asphalt speed bump over him. The motive was not passion or jealousy. It was the chillingly practical preservation of a criminal enterprise. In that quiet living room, all the scattered pieces, the client, the contractor, the axe, the tomb, snapped together into one horrifying, coherent picture. Based on Mark Hollis's confession and the assembled forensic evidence, the final hours of Luis Garza's life can now be reconstructed with chilling clarity. The chain of events began not in the parking lot, but with a panicked phone call. Teresa Hollis, realizing her intricate insurance fraud was about to be unraveled by a meticulous agent, summoned her younger brother Mark. She was the architect of the plan. He, indebted and easily dominated, would be the instrument. She explained that Garza was a threat that had to be neutralized permanently. The location was chosen for its terrible convenience, Mark's own worksite, a place where he had tools, equipment, and a legitimate reason to be. Luis Garza arrived at the Super Save lot just after 3 p.m. on October 12, 1982. He was a professional preparing for a routine, if slightly uncomfortable, client meeting. He saw Teresa Hollis waiting for him near the back of the lot, a section still marked by the machinery and materials of Hollis & Son Construction. She greeted him with a practiced, neighborly smile, and under the pretense of showing him a small dent on her car, lured him to a pre-selected spot away from the sightlines of the main storefront. It was a place of tactical advantage, with a large paving truck casting a long, deep shadow. From that shadow, Mark Hollis emerged. There was no conversation. There was no time for Luis Garza to even register the second figure. There was only the swift, heavy arc of the felling axe, followed by a single percussive thud that cut through the afternoon air. The confident voice of the insurance agent, which a moment before had been calmly explaining policy details, was silenced mid-sentence. He collapsed forward onto the gravel, his life extinguished in an instant of brutal, calculated violence. The silver buckle, a gift from his wife, was now just a piece of metal glinting in the dirt. What followed was not panic, but cold, methodical work. Under Teresa's unwavering command, they waited for the thin veil of dusk to thicken into the full cover of night. The construction site, which had been a place of commerce and progress by day, became their private burial ground. Mark started the engine of his paving machine, its industrial roar a deafening shroud for their work. They moved Garza's body into a shallow trench they had dug earlier. There was no hesitation. This was a problem being solved, a loose end being buried. Layer by painstaking layer, they poured the hot, black asphaltic binder and aggregate. The substance that builds modern roads became the material for an ancient tomb. With each pass of the compactor, the secret was pressed deeper into the earth, sealed from air and light. They crafted the crude speed bump with deliberate care, making it just misshapen enough to seem like a sloppy piece of work, but not so unusual as to invite inspection. When they were finished, they had not just hidden a body. They had integrated a man's grave into the mundane fabric of suburban life. To complete the deception, they drove Garza's locked sedan to a more central, visible spot in the parking lot, leaving the briefcase on the seat to create the illusion of a man who had simply walked away from his car and his life. The arrest of 82-year-old Teresa Hollis sent a shockwave through the quiet retirement community where she lived. The image of the frail great-grandmother, her face a mask of cold indifference, being led away in handcuffs, became a national news spectacle. She was the picture of respectable old age, a woman known for her prize-winning roses and participation in the community book club. The contrast between this public persona and the monstrous secret she had kept for 40 years was profoundly jarring. Throughout the investigation and her subsequent trial, she remained silent and defiant, offering no confession, no remorse, no explanation. Mark Hollis, in exchange for his full and detailed testimony against his sister, received a reduced sentence for second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. His confession in court was a broken, rambling account of a lifetime spent under his sister's domineering influence, a story of weakness and fear culminating in a single, horrific act of violence from which he could never escape. He would spend the remainder of his life in a state penitentiary, a frail old man haunted by the ghost of a crime he committed in his youth. Teresa Hollis's trial was a media sensation. The prosecution, led by Detective Romero's meticulous case file, laid out 40 years of evidence. They presented the forensic analysis of the asphalt-impregnated bones, the paving permits, the client list, and the damning testimony of her own brother. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found her guilty on all counts. The judge, calling her actions a chilling monument to calculated evil, sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Less than a year after her conviction, Teresa Hollis died of natural causes in the prison infirmary, taking her silence to the grave. For the family of Luis Garza, the verdict was a complex and hollow victory. His children, now adults with families of their own, sat in the front row of the courtroom every day. They had grown up with a ghost for a father, their lives shaped by the unanswered question of his disappearance. They listened to the brutal details of his final moments, a truth far more terrible than any of the scenarios they had imagined. Justice had been served, the legal ledger finally balanced, but it could not restore the 40 years that had been stolen. It was an answer, but it was not a comfort. Today, the site of the old Super Save is gone. The cracked, infamous parking lot was completely demolished, scraped down to the bare Texas soil, and a modern commercial complex now stands in its place. Where the makeshift tomb once lay, there is now a neatly landscaped island of manicured grass and young oak trees. There is no plaque, no memorial to mark the spot. The ground holds its secrets, and the new concrete has paved over the old. To the thousands of shoppers who walk this ground every day, it is just another piece of land, indistinguishable from any other. The case of the Super Save vanishing is officially closed. The legal system has rendered its final judgment. Mark Hollis is serving his sentence. Teresa Hollis is dead. The files have been returned to the archives, now thick with the details of a crime solved 40 years too late. But the resolution of a case is not the same as the healing of a wound. For the family of Luis Garza, the verdict provided an ending to a story, but not an end to their loss. His adult children were given one final item from the evidence locker, the tarnished silver belt buckle with its elegant initials, LG. It is the only tangible thing of their fathers that they have left from that day, a small, cold piece of metal that survived 40 years in the dark. The story serves as a chilling reminder that the most monstrous secrets can be hidden just beneath the surface of our ordinary world. They can lie dormant under our feet, concealed by the mundane structures we build and the convenient narratives we accept. Evil is not always a dramatic specter. Sometimes it is a quiet, respectable woman in a suburban home, a panicked phone call, and a crude speed bump built on a foundation of lies. And today, where that speed bump was, there is smooth, new asphalt, perfectly smooth, as if nothing had ever been beneath it. But the silence here is different. It rings.